It is my honor to introduce Samara Quintero, licensed marriage and family therapist, certified hypnotherapist, and the owner of Conscious Transformations. Samara is not only a skilled therapist, but also a passionate advocate for integrating plant medicine, hypnotherapy, and sound healing into therapeutic practices. As a lead facilitator at Segal Trials, a cannabis and psychedelic research center, Samara brings a wealth of knowledge in helping individuals transform their lives by addressing the root causes of pain and suffering. Her therapeutic approach, as you will learn from her presentation today, combines traditional clinical practices with powerful alternative modalities to help people reconnect to their true selves and live from a heart centered place. Today, Samara will guide us through an enlightened exploration of hypnotherapy, plant medicine, psychedelic integration, shedding a light on the profound potential for healing. Her insights combine clinical and indigenous approaches, which will offer us a fresh perspective on how we can heal the mind, body, and spirit. So, without further ado, everybody, Samara Quintero.
Question though. So when you are journeying with medicine, entities can show up, spirit guides can show up, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we're in the integration phase of the presentation. But essentially, if you can go in with an open mind and an open heart and kind of know, like, okay, whatever entity shows up or maybe whatever guide shows up, like, how can I get curious about this experience and like see what is it trying to show me or what is it trying to teach me? Because that can happen. That can definitely happen. And I think that's when it's really important to be able to prep for those type of experiences. And I'll talk a little bit about this later too. It is really important that you are in a safe container when you go into these spaces because you are in a very vulnerable place, right? So if you do decide to journey with ayahuasca or with any plant, I'm going to be focusing specifically on ayahuasca because that's the one I work with the most. But you always want to make sure that whoever is holding the space is holding it with integrity, that they're able to hold a safe container for you. And once you guys go into the field and if you choose to become therapists, also knowing for yourself that we're holding containers, and it's important to hold those containers with integrity and respect. Well, so discoveries that I started finding as I was kind of going in deeper into my clinical work. So I worked in rehabs for a long time. I worked in treatment centers probably from around 2013 to 2019. And I was working with people who had severe drug addiction, meth, heroin. It was during the opiate pandemic. So I was treating actually a lot of young people, like 25, 26 years old, deep in addiction. And what I realized through that work was that a lot of talk therapy was addressing the symptom. So it's like, all right, we're using these substances. How do we stop using these substances? How do we prevent relapse, essentially? And what I started to discover is that people would relapse all the time. And what it seemed that we weren't doing was really getting down to the root of the issue, right? Like to the root of why are these people using in the first place? Right. And once I started working with hypnotherapy, I started to incorporate that into my work with my clients at the treatment centers. And then once I could actually get them into a more relaxed nervous system, once they dropped out of the fight or flight, then we were able to kind of go down deeper into like what was the reason that they were medicating, and then get down to the root of what that wound was. And so that's when I realized that, there is a place for talk therapy, but then there's also this place for this deeper healing where we can access wounds that are deeper in the body, in the subconscious, that are almost like beyond our conscious awareness when we're just talking about the issue. Something that I also found was that our society in general is really disconnected from nature and has lost our connection with our ability to heal ourselves through really ancestral modalities. I mean, when we're talking about sound, when we're talking about plants, these are deeply ancestral practices that have been being held by these lineages for hundreds of years. So in a way, it's almost like reclaiming that magic, reclaiming that ancestral medicine, and then interweaving it with the clinical. so that we can really step into a more holistic way of healing ourselves and healing others. Yeah.
Who says it? Oh, J. Cole is like, you went a long way, but you went the wrong way. So like we're going a long way, but we're in the wrong direction.
Right? Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So, but like people think, oh, we went a long way, but it's the wrong way.
Well, and what if the long way is actually taking us to a new way? Right, which is like essentially what we're talking about. Like, okay, maybe we needed to go into the clinical avenue, and that there is a place for that Western medicine, right? But the new way, how can we incorporate both, right? So then that's like the ancient future, right? Bringing the past into where we are now and then weaving it together into something new.
For some reason, we found these intricate pieces and we can't replicate them because
and that's actually a great point, because to speak on that, like no one really knows out of all of the plants in the jungle, how did they know to mix chacruna with ayahuasca? To this day, no one has the answer to like how they got to that understanding, but somehow they figured that out. Right. And I mean, even when you go to the jungle, like I was just there last month and we were asking that question, like how to Pucallpa in Peru. And we were asking the curanderos, like, how did they know to like put these two together? And even they did. They're like, we don't know. They just taught us, you know? So it's one of those mysteries, right? That like sometimes the ancestors have the answers that even we don't have to this day. So talking a little bit about hypnotherapy. So and I want to check in, like, who is familiar with hypnotherapy? Or I think a lot of people just see it in the movies,
Yeah,
like that.
The
What
Clock.
was that movie?
I don't know.
The Clock, exactly. But it's like Get Out. What was the movie where it's like someone was getting hypnotized? You guys remember that one? Not so much.
There's a few.
There's a few of them. Yeah. So essentially, it's not as not really portrayed, I think, correctly in the movies. So what you're really doing is just inducing people into a more relaxed brainwave state. So when you're in a more relaxed brainwave, right now we're in beta, and I'll show you guys a little bit of a diagram of those brainwaves in a second. When we're able to drop people down to theta brainwave, that is where we access the subconscious. So that is where all of our limiting beliefs are. That's where all of our deepest programming is. That's where all of our stuff from childhood lives. So when we draw people down to that space, then we're able to reprogram their subconscious beliefs. So then when we're talking about cognitions, right, we're talking about thoughts. When I'm able to drop a client down into that lower brainwave, then we're able to the plasticity is a little bit softer. So we're able to really reprogram those negative beliefs into whatever it is that they want to change at that deeper level. And it also helps, yes. So what you're talking about is a delta brainwave. That's the sleep brainwave. So you're essentially getting people right here. Right now we're like in beta, and these upper ones. So when you're able to relax people to theta, right here, this is where it's like that trance-like, dream-like state.
Right.
So when you're like listening to binaural beats, for example, when you're like lost in a song, when you're in like that trance-like state, you're in theta brainwave. Okay, when you're with plant medicine, you're in theta brainwave, hypnotherapy. So they're all essentially different paths to be able to get to this space. Visualizing. So that's when, like, have you ever closed your eyes while you're listening to a song and gone on a drink with yourself? You're just visualizing, right? Or like when they talk about manifesting, right? So like using the mind's eye to create that visual. Does that make sense? Yes. No, so I use it with no plant medicine at all. Yeah, so it's like a standing modality on its own. And then the plant medicine is its own standing modality. And then sound is like interweaved into those two. Makes sense, okay. So kind of moving on to the medicine of the plants. So utilizing certain plant medicines such as psilocybin, ayahuasca, chemical, and the mystical experiences that I was just talking about, profound introspection. So essentially, if you think of hypnotherapy, it's like the mild sauce. So if we're traveling with ayahuasca, we are spicy. Like you are deep, deep in it. Okay, and that's when the medicine is really showing you, it's like a mirror. It's showing you your shadows, it's showing you all of that stuff that's inside to heal you. Okay, and that's again why it's so important, because you're in such a vulnerable space to be in that really safe container. Okay, and talking about it from a neurological perspective, what ayahuasca does is slow down something called the DMN network. So if you think about this part of your brain, this is the one that holds your sense of self. So like the I, the ego, the me, my pain, my suffering, my, whatever it is, loss of a relationship, all of those I's, right? And what happens with people that have severe anxiety, for example, they have a really active DMN network. So for example, someone with like severe anxiety, let's say you go into a party, and it's like all the thoughts start coming in. Oh my gosh, did I just say that? Was that stupid? I shouldn't have said that. Oh my gosh, I shouldn't have came here. Blah 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 blah. That is an overactive DMN network.
What
So that's a beta brainwave because you are in an active. So you're active, but what happens is that the DMN is more activated. So when you sit with plant medicine, it slows that part of your brain down, and then you're able to access just different thoughts that you might never have had, realizations or insights that were not available before, right? And then that's the neuroplasticity of the brain. When the DMN slows down, then you're able to create those new neural pathways, essentially reprogramming yourself. Okay. And then there's also non-psychedelic plants that are part of the jungle, a part of the indigenous lineages. I actually brought some so that you guys could see. So you guys might be familiar with sage.
Right, yeah.
Right, and I also brought some, so these are called aguas floridas. So they're actually waters that are made from the plants of the jungle. So if do you guys want to smell them? Okay, awesome. When you're in ayahuasca ceremony, the curanderos, they have their altar similar to this space. And then they use different plants to essentially protect the container. Okay, so this is one of the ones that they use. And there's different kinds. So I have tobacco, lavender, and then this is the plastic. So tobacco is actually like a deeply sacred plant. Unfortunately,
now we're doing this.
I know. Unfortunately, in the Western world, we've kind of like decimated tobacco and like really hurt it in a lot of ways, colonized it.
I was reading, I'm from Puerto Rico.
Okay.
And I was reading on indigenous tribes of Taínos and how they used to use tobacco, and it was part of their rituals. And I was like,
I mean,
Does
even
that
if you think
sense?
of like the North American indigenous, like with the peace pipes, and they have tobacco. Tobacco is a deep cleanser. It's similar to sage. So the curanderos in ayahuasca ceremony, they will cleanse with tobacco. So it's like they look like rolled cigarettes, but they're called mapachos. And they'll blow it like through the container to kind of clean the space as everyone's journeying. And they also do something called sokas on people that are just essentially cleaning out your energetic field. And I got a question over here that was really good. You were essentially asking like, what's the role of the curandero?
Yeah.
Right. So the role of the curandero is to hold the space, right? So if you think about it similar to the therapist and the client, they're essentially the therapist in the room, right? And so they're holding the space as you journey with the medicine. Right, and then the more skilled that your curandero is, essentially, like how much work he has done himself, he or she, then the space is going to be even more pristine and clear. Right, so they're keeping everything clean. Like you said, if there's like an entity or something that seems to be dark or hurting the person. They come in, they clean the space. They can sense it. Yeah, essentially, if you think about like someone who has a PhD in psychology, it's like how many years, how much time did it take for them to get to that space? A curandero, you want to make sure they have their PhD in the plant. Yeah, so here's a little video of, this is the first time that I went to the jungle and I did my first diet. I'll tell you guys a little bit about what diets are. And right here, this is Maestro Mauro. So he's the curandero that holds the containers. We're journeying, and right here he's making the ayahuasca. So if you see those long sticks, that's the ayahuasca vine. And then those green leaves, that's the chacruna. So they put like a layer of the vine, a layer of the chacruna, and then they cook it overnight. And then that's what begins to dilute the medicine, and it comes out as in liquid form. And then you drink it. And then you drink it. That can happen. Yeah, that can happen. And it could also be exactly what you guys are talking about. There could be 12 people in the maloca, which is like the space where you sit with the medicine. Everyone is on their own journey, right? So everyone's kind of going through their own experiences. And it's so interesting. Yeah, it's like maybe the Jew is seeing Moses and the Muslim is seeing Muhammad, but at the end of the day, it's like, what is it that they're connecting to? And what is that experience allowing them to see, right? And so that's where, when we get to the integration piece, so it's almost like not getting too lost in the content, but more so of like, what is that trying to show you? Exactly. And then when you can integrate the message, right, then that's where that deeper healing starts to happen, right? So it's almost like we want to drop a little bit out of the mind that wants to understand, right? Like, oh, that doesn't make sense, Moses and then Muhammad, how could it be, right? But more so like, how can we drop into the heart and really get into what is the feeling that created for me in the body? So in the jungle, it's not just about sitting with ayahuasca, right? It's also about building relationships with different master plants, so different medicinal plants of the jungle. So these are, this is just an example. There's Bowinsana, Chiricsanango, Aguasacha. There's so many. There's like tons of little ones. These are the smaller ones. And then there's the bigger trees. And so the curanderos, for example, their way of doing their bachelor's and master's and PhD is to diet these different plants, right? So what happens when you diet a plant? You're essentially drinking a tea of that plant. So if I'm going to diet Bowinsana, I'm going to start drinking it in tea form to receive the medicinal properties of that plant. And so then what happens is then the Bowinsana begins to infuse into my DNA. So essentially it kind of becomes a part of who I am. So then when you're sitting in ceremony, then you can start calling on the energy of the Bowinsana. And she will come in as a guardian in the container, right? So a curandero who's done his work has done lots of different diets. And you'll hear them in their curos begin to call in the energy of all the different plants. So all the guardians and the allies start to kind of come in to help hold that frequency of the container, right? So the more diets that you've done, the more essentially, like more you've cleaned out your channels, and the more that you're kind of holding the medicine of the jungle. Okay, so these plants are not necessarily psychedelic. Yeah, so for example, Chiricsanango, some people have had visions with that one. But I've dieted Bowinsana, and I just recently dieted Aposacha. And it opens up your dream world. I'll say that. Like, you will start to have a lot of different dreams, and they tell you to write down your dreams, which is really interesting, because then we can start going into like the Jungian, like Carl Jung and his whole like collective unconscious and interpretation of dreams. But yeah, those plants are not so visionary. Oh. I haven't seen anything in terms of dieting, like integrating it into clinical work, but it would be really interesting.
Yeah, right?
Sound. So sound is interesting, because if you think about with hypnotherapy, both hypnotherapy and with plant medicine, both of them integrate sound. So whenever I'm inducing a client into hypno, I'm utilizing sound. Sound is it's like a helper that helps to begin to slow down those brain waves, um, lowers your heart rate, decreases stress levels. There's a particular frequency that is the healing frequency, 432 hertz. Okay, so this flute, for example, is tuned to 432 hertz. And you guys will hear it when I play it. You'll begin to kind of feel that slowing down and just more like a peaceful sensation in the body. Okay, and it does exactly what hypno and plant medicine does. It begins to move you into those brain waves of the theta, right? And it slows down your fight or flight. So it slows people down out of that like dysregulated nervous system. So it's really interesting the particular kind of sound that they use in ayahuasca ceremonies. They're called icaros. Have you guys heard of? Okay, cool. So the curandero comes in. So if you think of a doctor, the maloca is the hospital, right? And you're the patient. And then the icaro is the scalpel. So the icaro carries that particular, and they're if it's a good curandero, they're really skilled at being able to, with the icaro, the frequency of that song, to be able to work with the medicine, and then they're able to kind of go exactly to where your wound is, right? And begin to kind of move it out of the body. And when you're sitting with ayahuasca, there's something called la purga, or the purge, which is the vomiting, or it can also come out the other way. But you're essentially moving out all of the stuff, the crap in your body, limiting beliefs, any illnesses, physical illnesses, emotional illnesses. And it's the icaro that's really kind of working the medicine to be able to do the healing. From my perspective, I say the purge is a part of the healing.
Right, okay.
As somebody who has experienced it, I would say yes.
You would say so? Interesting.
Yeah, it's like when you're purging and when you're in ceremony, like you will feel the release of whatever that like illness or stuckness is in your body. But it would be really interesting to have like some evidence-based. And if you can even think about it from the context of repressed emotions, it's like when something is repressed, when I'm suppressing, repressing, pushing down, it takes energy to do that. And it's kind of like you're holding something in, right? So with therapy, what you're doing is helping someone move that energy out, right? We're facing what is repressed. We're looking at it and releasing it from the body. So this is just a context in which they're doing it energetically and physically. But when we're in like a room with a client, that's essentially what you're helping them purge, right?
In the shakapa?
Yes, yeah. So the shakapa is, I'm going to show you guys a video in a second where you're going to see an icaro. They're going to sing, and you'll see the shakapa. So it's essentially these leaves that are found in the jungle, and the curandero has his shakapa as he's singing the icaro. So the icaro is moving with the shakapa, and the shakapa is like moving the icaro around the maloca. So it's a tool that he uses, just like the icaro. And it brings in a particular sound. You'll hear in the video. So this is a video, so who I go with to the jungle, she's in the middle. Her name is Daniela Riojas. She's done over 15 diets in the jungle. Yeah, I know. She's like, and you can feel it when you're around her, like she carries the medicine. Maestro Mauro, he's the one who owns the retreat center that we go to. And then her maestra is Maestra Ayman, the one who's there to her left hand side. So she goes, the diets that I do are about 10 days. She goes and does month-long diets in the jungle, and she's by herself, just with her maestra. Right, so this is like deep work that she's doing. And again, it's like the more that you do your diets and you do your work, the better you hold your space. So she holds like a very a clean, very safe container. And this is an example of an icaro. So if you see right there in the middle, they're holding a shakapa. I would say if you're interested, first do a ceremony here in the States and then go and do your diet in the jungle. But it's almost like you want to prepare your nervous system because it's a lot on the nervous system. So start small. And then like the diet is more of this up level. Curandero and the containers was going to help you to not have a bad experience. Okay. You guys kind of get the gist of it, you know. So they're singing the icaros, and then the shakapa is that's the instrument that they play with the icaro. Those are kind of like the journeys, the 3 pillars, and now we're kind of moving into how do we integrate those experiences, right? And what are the clinical modalities that best serve to integrate those experiences? So from what I found is parts work. Who's familiar with IFS? Parts work a little bit. Okay. So first, I'll talk a little bit about Jungian individuation. Carl Jung. So he talks a lot about the concept of individuation. What is individuation? Right. So essentially, if you think about the human being, right, our goal is to become whole, right? So when you were talking about, you know, it's like, what's the purpose of the purge, right? Is to be able to move out those repressed emotions. And if you think about the repressed emotions almost as shadows. So they're sometimes the aspects of ourselves that we don't necessarily want to look at. They might be the aspects of ourselves that we're not even necessarily conscious of. Right. So what happens is when you journey and, you know, with hypnotherapy or with the plants, you're going to come face to face with shadows. You're going to come face to face with your inner child, with the parts of you that are really scared, maybe with the parts of you that feel unlovable. You know, all of those different parts that are essentially hidden in the shadows, they come out, right, so that they can be integrated. Right, so instead of like, oh, I'm so frustrated that I get so scared with that, what happens is we begin to shift out of that. It's like, instead of becoming frustrated with myself, you know, how can I begin to take a look at, oh, that's just a scared part of me. Oh, that's just the little girl part of me, and she was really scared in the dark growing up, right? And when I can see it as just an aspect of who I am, instead of pushing it away, how can I integrate it into who I am, right? So integration is, instead of getting frustrated or repressing it, it's what does that part of me need from the wiser part of who I am? So what does the fearful part need from the mother inside of me, from the adult part of me? Right, and that's essentially what individuation is. How can I integrate that part, and instead of pushing it away, begin to give it what it needs, nurturing that part, reassuring that part, loving that part, and then that part stops fighting. So we're not in a battle with ourselves as much anymore, and then we're deeper in our wholeness, right? And that's like the authentic self. When I'm able to just be who I am without so much fear or so much density in my body, then I'm more whole, right? And that kind of goes into IFS, which IFS is internal family systems. That approach just essentially looks at what I was just saying. It kind of has the concept of the self, the observer, and then what are all the different parts of me, right? And then how can I begin to heal those different parts of myself? Okay, does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? Sure, yeah, breathwork is actually a beautiful modality. So breathwork actually goes into somatic-based therapies, right? So it's incorporating the body to be able to reach those healings, right? So breathwork, it's not part of my practice, but it definitely is. Some people are specifically trained in breathwork, where it's slowing down people's nervous systems, right? So when you're in that space, then you can take a look at like, oh, who is that part of me that feels really unloved? Oh, that was me when I was 5 years old, and you know, my mom said whatever to me, and then I started to feel she didn't love me, right? And it's like, oh, then what does that part of me need? She just needs to know that she's loved. Oh, so then how can I give that to myself? right? And then beginning to kind of have almost that inner dialogue with those different parts. And breath work is a modality to be able to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
And I asked him like, so how does that affect like you raise your kids? Because I remember I asked someone that and she said, I don't make comments on her weight. My mom said that and I was like, wow, yeah.
That's beautiful.
So yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, even with that, it's kind of like, how do I parent myself? How do I take care of myself? Right, which is a lot of this kind of work. Right, so for example, this past time that I was in the jungle, I was facing a lot of like inner fears. So for example, the sun goes down like at 5:30 in the jungle and you're just in the dark. And it is dark. There is no electricity, and you are hearing everything in the jungle. All kinds of animals. You just have a little candle, and just feeling all of those inner fears showing up, right? And so it's almost like, am I going to go on a bad trip? Am I going to feed this fear and start freaking out and like, oh my gosh, what was that? And like, why did I bring myself here? And I should have never done this. And like, let that kind of drive me into a bad trip. Or what do I need for myself so that I can stay anchored and centered and like within myself, right? So again, like, what did that scared part of me really need in that moment? Right. So when I was like laying in my little casita, it's like this little wooden house and like just in the middle of the dark and like listening to everything around me. It was just a moment of closing my eyes and anchoring in of like, I am safe, I am protected, I am okay. And being able to breathe and soothe that part of myself. Right? So it's not just about teaching these modalities to others. It's like, how do we embody these practices? And when you can embody it, that's when it's real, right? So it's like, I'm not just showing the client how to do it, but I'm actively practicing it in those moments. And when you do that, then you can hold a better container for your clients, right? So it's like, you are the curandero when you go into the therapy room, do your work, and then go and heal. That's a great question. I think it can be helpful to a certain degree, right? So there's the level of understanding, right? So it's like, can I understand my shadow? Can I like see what it's about? And then the deeper level is like, how can I begin to be with my shadow to really have the experience of like seeing that part of myself that I don't like? And that's what, for example, when you're like in hypno or with the plants, you're like really viscerally in the experience, right? So doing the journaling can help because it's like preparing you for having the embodied journey with it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then I just wanted to show a little bit about, and we touched a little bit on this earlier, like how do we integrate or how can we see like what the indigenous approach shows us, and then also see what the clinical approach shows us, but then also kind of seeing how it really interweaves in a lot of ways too. Right, so through the clinical, we use different language. For example, we use parts, like I was just discussing, the subconscious, the shadow, the inner child. When you're in the indigenous world, they might use words such as soul loss. They also use a word called sustos, which in Spanish means fears. So when someone has a susto, what they're essentially talking about is a trauma. Right, so if at 11 years old I had a susto, my parents divorced, and something happened that was overwhelming in my body during that time, and I started to feel abandoned by my father. So that's what the curandero would call, a susto happened. So they have to reintegrate that part. Right? They use ritual, energetic healing, more of a spiritual perspective. Right? And then we're using talk therapy and a lot of emphasis on self-awareness. And again, healing through sub-personalities, which is healing through the parts, different parts of us. And then they use those concepts of soul retrieval. So essentially, it's all kind of like an integrating of the self. They're just seeing it, they're using the word soul and retrieving the soul right? When we're just using the word parts, retrieving, reclaiming the part, integrating the different parts, right? Both rely on a guide, whether it's the therapist or the curandero, and we're both essentially healing the fragmentation that trauma causes. So I just want to touch briefly on the importance of reciprocity. Okay, so what I mean by reciprocity is being in right relationship. So when we're talking about these concepts, right, and I think you had mentioned Maria Sabina earlier, right? What has happened, unfortunately, is sometimes people have come in from the Western world, came in, taken the mushroom or whatever it was, came, extracted it, and then didn't give credit to where it came from. So essentially it's perpetuating the colonization that has brought severe trauma to South America in a lot of ways, and to the indigenous that have held these medicines with a lot of respect and humility, and sometimes there'll be Westerners that come down there and they'll be like, I want to diet, I want to diet this tree and I want to diet it for a month, without really understanding like what that means. So there's a big part of this renaissance and like bringing in the indigenous is also remembering to do it with respect, to do it with reverence, and to understand that these people have been working with these medicines for a long, long time. So when we're talking about healing with psychedelics, right, I think it's really important to include the ancestral aspect of psychedelic work and to really teach people, because I think people just don't know. So having these talks and being able to share on the magic of these lineages so people can understand, and we're going to bring in psychedelics into the Western to be able to do it in the right way, honoring where it came from.
So it's only necessary to be from that ancestry, as long as you respect and understand it.
Exactly. That you're not, because what can happen sometimes and what is happening is people are like, oh, I sit one time with ayahuasca and then I come back and I want to be a curandero. And they'll hold, and it's very, very dangerous because then you're like opening up this whole container. And imagine, it's like saying, I want to do therapy, I want to do deep trauma work with this client, and I'm taking intro to psychology. Like you could potentially cause more harm. And a lot of people, unfortunately, have experienced ceremonial trauma, where they go with people that are not holding the medicine in a good way, and then they're like opening all types of stuff, and the person hasn't done their work, and it can get really, really chaotic and messy, Now, what we decide to do with it and how we utilize it, that's really up to us. And just like a therapist, it's like you go in, you work with your client from an ethical standpoint, from a place of integrity. It's the same plant medicine. It can be used for a lot of good, or it could unfortunately cause a lot of harm too. Yeah, that happens a lot, right?
Yeah, that's what I imagine,
In that
right?
case, I typically seek some type of supervision.
Okay.
So that's what's called client clinical review, right? So you can review with other peers, other colleagues, supervisors of like, hey, I have this case and I don't know what to do. And getting that outside supervision can be really useful. And also determining within yourself, do I have the capacity and the tools to be able to help this client? Right. So if we kind of use that example with the medicinal world, ayahuasca is not for everybody.
Sure, yeah.
And sometimes people will come and sit with the medicine, and the curandero will say, like, this person is not going to benefit from this medicine. Right? So it's also knowing your capacity and what is your medicine? What are you bringing? And if that person is kind of beyond your specialization, like having that discernment within yourself as a therapist of like, okay, I've done what I can, but I might need to refer them out to someone who maybe could better serve them. This is just a little bit on like knowing, so essentially what we've been talking about, right? So it's like knowing what we understand at the cognitive level, understanding concepts, understanding the clinical, doing those parts of having the knowledge, and then merging that with the embodied experience, right? And what I've also been saying is just always remembering to do your own personal work. I think that's my biggest suggestion to anyone coming into the field If you want to hold space, if you want to be a curandera or curandero in your therapy room, do your work. And that way you can just be a clear channel. You're not going to be experiencing as much transference. You're just going to be way more able to hold that container for someone because you face your own shadows. I'll introduce a little bit of the sound of the flute so you guys can experience the medicine of the flute. And maybe just even taking into account, like, how are you feeling right now? Noticing your own anxiety level or your own stress level, maybe making a note of that. And then at the end, seeing if you experience any difference.